What do minions, explosions, and bosses all have in common? This turns out not a whole lot, but if you guessed that you can use an awesome Commander Moto charge calling build to take down every boss in the game using explosions, then you might just be onto something. Since the start of the season, I've been playing this build and polishing up the gear. At this point, it's a great boss killer that still has a pretty decent mapping experience, and all around, it's a build that feels great to play. So if you're ready to take on the Lord of the Void Sea, or maybe find your next favorite build, then this might be the exact video for you. On the other hand, if you're just getting started and want a more basic version of the character, do be sure to check out my season starter, which is in the card and down in the description below. Before I get into the details a little bit more, I'd like to take a moment to thank this video's sponsor, XD. Commander Moto Charge Calling was added alongside the Blacksail content, and he is quite good at taking down some of its toughest bosses. Plus, you get to use the new endgame progression system, Hero Relics and Hero Memories, to further customize Commander Moto or any other hero trait of your choice to better suit your playstyle and build. If you want to check out Torchlight Infinite's Blacksail season, while also supporting the channel, do be sure to use my link, which will be down in the description and of course the pinned comment below. This build is awesome. It has insane damage and can completely trivialize fights like the Tier 8 Traveler or 2 Invitation Lord of the Void Sea. It can do Lord of the Void Sea 3, but he's a massive health sponge, so I don't do that too much. Though I did also try Path of the Brave 5, and that was no trouble either. Now, unlike a lot of other boss killers, which tend to perform pretty poorly when mapping, there's an alternate mapping setup you can use, which makes things go pretty quickly. Are you going to get sub 1 minute clears? No, probably not. But you're still going to be clearing a Tier 8 map with full compasses for maximum offset in a really decent amount of time. The mapping setup is honestly a little bit clunkier than the boss killing setup, but personally I wouldn't say the playstyle's too bad either way. Now, towards the start of the video, I did mention my season starter, and here are the important changes that you need to know about if you played that version and you want to swap over to this one. First is that the hero trait selection and talents are much the same, but I'm using a different hero relic, instead focusing on increased hero memory effect. For the second modifier, I really look for anything I could find, such as minion crit rating. If you're going to be killing bosses, the medium talent in the Alchemist tree to remove damage over time effects when you use the restoration skill is incredibly important. And personally, I always like to have the gain a barrier when using sentry skills, so that I can keep my barrier up when I'm just standing still hitting the boss, not moving around, thus gaining it from kinetic conversion. Because the skills are mostly the same as the previous version, I'm not going to get into that too much either. Though, if you want to play the mapping variant, there is one important swap to make. You take Shadow Dash out, and you put on Leap Attack combined with Mage's Assistant Gloves. This will set your Leap Attack to 4 attacks per second, regardless of your attack speed, which feels great when mapping and makes you much faster. But if you're not careful, you can also interrupt your Spider Tank summoning when mapping while using this item. I'm not sure why this is, if it's a bug or if it's fully intended, but the 4 attacks per second does seem to apply to your Spider Tanks as well, and if you summon them too quickly, they won't be able to attack and explode on the enemies. Big shout out to ZenM or Zen Master over here on YouTube, another Maxwell member who found this neat tech. Now, with the 8% sealed mana from my helmet and the restrain support, I'm able to run Weapon Amplification, Fearless, and Erosion Enhancement. Right now, I'm running the precise version to be able to inflict paralysis on my enemies. This is quite a greedy setup in terms of damage auras, and mana is fairly tight. So if you don't have a restrain and don't have a helmet, just drop either Weapon Amplification or Erosion Enhancement and you'll have a pretty good time. In the past, I was using Swiftness, but with the mapping setup, I don't really need high move speed. Instead, I just go for 4 attacks per second. Now, another change is I converted Summon Frostspirit over to pure utility with Mark and Blinding support. Mark makes enemies take increased critical damage, and my minions are going to be critting all the time. Blind means damage has a 20% chance to miss, and taking less hits is always good. The other change I made is adding another skill to my auto defense. Before, I was just using Protection Field. Now I'm using both Protection Field, which transfers some of my damage to minions, and Reform to strengthen my barrier while refreshing it. To fit this in on as little life reservation as possible, I am using Precise Seal Conversion. This is quite expensive and honestly not worth it unless you have money to spare. Be sure to use regular Seal Conversion, do not use Cost Conversion, They have the same icon, seal conversion affects reservations, and cost conversion affects active skills such as you'll find up here. Now where you'll find most of my changes are in the gearing. First up, I'm using a Long Night Sorcerer's Mask. This gives me +1 spell skill level, at the cost of -1 max focus blessing. Luckily, Winter of Origin says own additional stacks of focus blessing. Therefore, I get to completely ignore this penalty. I went with max life and minion life to try to optimize both my own defenses and my minions' damage. Sealed Mana so I could fit in the extra aura comfortably. Erosion res, because of course, who doesn't want erosion resistance? Dying to erosion damage is bad. Crit damage, because I'm already crit capped, and 7% chance for minions to deal double damage. Since minions dealing double damage means more mechanical parts, and, well, they hit twice as hard. If you want to have more information on the Long Night Sorcerer's Mask and other special bases, do be sure to check out my video on special bases that's in the card right now, and also down in the description below. Next up, I've got the Ranger's Rag, which is another special base. This adds Tenacity Blessing, so I have an additional defensive layer that grants 4% additional damage reduction, stacking up to 4 times. On this, I've got 30% max life, T1 max life, +2 active skill level. Both of my spider tanks are active skills, so they're going to be a nice portion of my damage, and they get a big boost from this. Then I filled all the suffixes with resistances, since I can get crit elsewhere. Of course, the Warden's Breastpin, completely unchanged from before. It's, in fact, the very same Warden's Breastpin that I talked about in my first video. Now for the gloves, I already talked about the Mage's Assistant, which is my mapping solution, but for single target, I'm using Miniature Void C. This adds a massive amount of damage through 7% minion damage for every minion you have. At first glance, this does seem to be an additional damage multiplier, though I'll be honest, I haven't tested it too rigorously. What I did test is that it feels awesome once you put these on, and your DPS becomes so high that you can't really measure it on the dummy anymore. Restoration skills get 80% restoration duration, is the corroded version of this. Normally this is a penalty to restoration skills. You can still use them to take off a nasty dot, but this allows them to recover a lot of extra health, especially if you're using residues. Of course, the Winter of Origin and the Mind Infusion are pretty much the same as before. In fact, these are the same Winter of Origin and Mind Infusion from my original video. I did at one point corrode this. The gamble paid off, I got 7 additional stacks, so I'm gaining the additional cooldown recovery as well. One big change is I'm no longer using the 2 interlocking souls. While getting 6% of your max life whenever you use a summon skill is quite nice, if you want far more single target damage, you need something like this. I have tier 1 minion damage, +3 minion skill level. This should actually be minion max life, but I purchased this item for 150 FE and it came crafted as is. You could also reroll this with Ominous Embers to have +5 main skill level. Then I've got crit strike damage, minion base crit rating, and chance for minions to deal double damage. These are definitely the best damage suffixes on this item currently. Note, the reason I'm not using isomorphic arms here is when I use isomorphic arms, it causes my minions to behave a little bit weirdly. This is a known bug, it has been reported, and honestly, the Winter of Origin setup feels really good anyway. Then I've got the 2 rings. For one, I'm using a Graceful ring, which has the 12% max life implicit. I went for max life, minion damage, as many resistances as I needed. This elemental and erosion sleepless suffix is especially important, as that caps out my elemental resistances, pretty much minus my lightning, which I was just a little lazy with rolling, while giving me enough erosion, but I'm not too worried about dying to bosses. The adds lightning damage to attacks and spells is an ominous prefix. I was hoping to get lucky and hit % life plus defenses. I didn't hit it yet. I think it costs an average of 240 FE to hit it, so I'm sure I'll get her eventually, but I didn't want to keep putting in the currency chasing what really felt like diminishing returns. And then for my other ring, I've got a Prisoner ring for the 32% crit strike damage. Remember, with Warden's Breastpin, this goes straight to my minions at 90% of a value. With a higher roll, this could go at up to 100% of a value. I've also got Erosion Res, Fire Res, and the Sleepless suffix for critical strike damage. The life regen is just a nice to have, but absolutely isn't necessary. You could go with a crafted minus skill cost, or again, another ominous prefix if you happen to hit it. In terms of extremely key items to look out for, defensively, the Ranger's Rag is pretty much unbeatable, and it's quite nice to have % of max life on the Graceful Ring. For damage, the big standout pieces are the Miniature Void C, the Winter of Origin, and the Vanquisher Mallet. While Mind Infusion is nice, you could replace this with Rare Boots, or use something like Decayed Mind for a ring slot instead. And so those are my changes as opposed to the season start variant of this build. While everything isn't necessarily 100% perfect, it's min-maxed to the point where I'm at diminishing returns, and I can already do all the content Leptis has to offer. The build excels in taking down tanky enemies like bosses, or running through high offset T8s. It's never going to be the fastest boss rusher in T7 if speed farming's more of your jam. Recently, I used the build to take down close to 100 Uber Travelers, because I was farming them and wanted to see what he dropped. If you're interested in that video, maybe let me know down in the comments and then get subscribed. While you're down there, leave a like. If you have notifications on, you could see that popping up in the near future as well. One thing that I like about this build is you can play it from day one and scale it all the way through the toughest endgame content. It's not perfect. Sometimes your overload does fall off while mapping, and that feels quite bad. Although having a little bit of overload duration, such as on your relic, definitely helps to fix this. Gloves of a Mage's Assistant are quite good for jumping through maps, but they make your summon spider tanks feel a little bit wonky if you're just holding down the button or spamming too quickly. Try to just tap the button and pace things out a little bit more. Speaking of tapping, if you're playing on mobile, this is a pretty darn mobile-friendly build, as you're able to tank most hits and your minions will do a lot of the heavy lifting. Plus, it's not like you need to rotate through a bunch of buffs or anything like that. Even on minimal gear, this build's super strong. And again, check out my video for the season start version for more information on that. A big thanks again to XD for sponsoring this video. Personally, I think this is one of the best builds added in Season 2, and it's perfect for taking down the toughest bosses Blacksail has to offer. If you want to check out Blacksail for yourself, again, you can do so and help to support the channel by using my link down in the description or the pinned comment. Now, normally, I'm not really a minion player, and I didn't really mesh with Moto order calling. It's something that was fun to play once, but not an experience I'd likely repeat. This build, though, is super awesome. Maybe I'm just biased and I like explosions too much, but I'd definitely play it again in the future. The playstyle's slightly quirky, but not too bad, and I really like having a build that I can start from day one, is tanky, and ends up being all content viable. How does it work exactly? I have no idea, but as long as everything explodes and I get to pick up the loot, does it really matter? So you tell me, what do bosses and explosions have in common in Torchlight Infinite? And is Explody Moto, Charge Calling, a build for you? Be sure to put those thoughts down in the comments below. And before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. I'm sure all the patrons watch these videos with a fresh cup of nitroglycerin every morning. If you want something else to watch, or maybe something else to read, there's going to be a variety of resources, both in the video card and down in the description below, including a written guide over on Maxwell GG about how to level the character and scale it into the endgame. Or of course, you can always go with a recommendation that's on screen right now. But that's all for me today. Thank you for watching, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.